How might other observations justify the claim the universe contains imperfections that are evidence against theism? According to evidential arguments from evil, there are observations about evil that show theism is false, all things considered. These observations include general facts about the kinds, amounts, and distributions of evils in the world, and particular facts about evil, like children who suffer from cancer, fawns that die in forest fires, and Holocaust victims who suffer horrendously. Premise M claims God's perfection rules out unjustified evils as imperfections. So why believe Premise N that claims there are such imperfections as unjustified evils? I will argue we can justify Premise N using an inductive method and the moral assumption that the world is, on the whole, imperfect unless all its wrong-making properties are sufficiently counterbalanced by right-making properties, both known and unknown. We'll let N be God's allowance of any seemingly unjustified evil or imperfection, R any unknown right-making property, and W any unknown wrong-making property, such that there are only 4 possible outcomes for any particular N. In 3 of these 4 possibilities, N is an unjustified evil, all things considered, because it has wrong-making characteristics that are not counterbalanced by its right-making characteristics. So it is 3 times as likely any particular N is an unjustified evil. Supposing there may be some right-making and wrong-making properties unknown to us, the atheist philosopher Michael Tooley shows the probability all these evils are actually morally justified to allow, all things considered, must be less than 1 over N plus 1. Because N is a very large number, the probability it is morally permissible to allow all these evils is extremely small. Thus, we have inductively justified premise N that there are probably some unjustified evils, all things considered. Therefore, my conclusion O follows. Theism is probably false, all things considered.
Okay, I'll let you talk. The only thing I would say, just very briefly, is it's really tricky to count like each instance of like apparent evil, and I think that's going to be a problem.
Well, I will get into that. Okay, so
wait, hold on. I want to say one thing.
Go ahead.
Tooley uses a non-standard version of inductive probability to make this argument. This is a Tooley-inspired argument, and Callum Miller has shown major problems with using that kind to make this argument from evil as well. So if anybody wants to be interested in that, that's there.
Okay, I'm going to share a different screen this time. Hold on, let me stop sharing real quick. Oh wait, sorry, I kind of screwed up there. Let's see here. All right, hopefully this still works. Go ahead. Okay, so I don't know if you probably won't be able to read this, but so one of the first things, right, is just general considerations, right? So the way that the probability works is this. You have theoretical content of theism. God is all powerful, all knowing, all good. And because of this, what theism predicts is that God's goodness predicts that God can only do the best kind of action where there is one and no non-best kind of action, right? And so the argument is that there can only be a best state of affairs and a lack of bad or non-best state of affairs. But since we do see a bad state of affairs or a non-best state of affairs, then theism makes a false prediction, right? This is generally how the argument from evil is presented. And with the problem of evil, also, I think it really depends upon the theoretical content of theism, right? This will be important when we get into axiology. But another general consideration I want to point out is that specific facts are irrelevant. So Ben's actually later on in the debate, in a few sections after this, he sort of goes over like very specific facts about evil, right? And the problem here is that I think this is a methodological error, right? You know, in a scientific theory, we don't ask like, you know, why did this apple fall or why do apples fall, right? But rather, why do objects attract en masse, right? So that's the question we need to ask on a scientific basis, right? And so I think the same sort of thing should apply to evil, where it's like when we ask, hey, well, why did the fawn burn in the forest? Why do children get cancer, right? Those are too specific, right? What we need to be asking instead is why would God allow bad states of affairs to obtain? I think if we can answer that question, right, then the problem of evil is not going to really work. And I think if you can answer the more general question of why God allows bad states of affairs, then specific facts are not really going to be relevant to that, right? And so another third general consideration I want to point out here is this distinction between evolutionary worlds versus best kind of worlds versus special creation. Now, Ben doesn't specifically talk about evolution. I mean, he does talk about evolution later on, which I know, Tim, you could probably say more on that later if you want. But the point is, like, evolution, like, okay, so think of it like this. So what Ben's going to want to say is that, well, evolution is evidence for naturalism, since on theism we can have special creation, right? where theism makes more likely special creation and not evolutionary creation, right? And whereas on naturalism, you do have evolutionary creation, right? And so then in that case, naturalism, or at least evolutionary creation, would be evidence for naturalism, right? That's the argument, right? But the problem is that it's equally true that theism is only compatible with the best kind of worlds, right? And so on theism, you have it where there can only be best kinds of worlds, right? And no non-best or no worse worlds, right? But on naturalism, there also cannot be what's called special creation, right? So I would grant, I agree with Ben here that, if we did live in a specially created world, that would definitely be evidence against naturalism, right? I can grant that. But I also think there's a sort of symmetry there, right? Where it's like, well, okay, if theism can only allow best kinds of worlds, and if naturalism can only allow for evolutionary worlds, then there needs to be more work done, right? There needs to be more work done, because on naturalism, the thing on naturalism is that naturalism, you're allowed to have non-best kinds of worlds on naturalism, right? You're allowed to have these worlds where everything's just tragic, right? Where there's no range, there's no like fine-tuned range of good and evil states, right? And so on naturalism, it's fully compatible with the worst kind of world, right? But on theism, you can't have that, right? So there has to be, my point is like, there has to be more work done when it comes to at least that argument, right? This whole idea that, evolution is supposed to support naturalism over theism. I think the problem there is that it's ignoring this symmetry breaker, right? Where there seems to be a symmetry between theism not allowing for worse worlds and naturalism not allowing for special creation, right? I just want to point that out there just as a general consideration for now, because I know Tim he could say more on evolutionary evils later.
Well, I just want to ask if Zach understands the point you just made.
You understand?
Yeah, I think gosh, there's obviously a lot that is like happening right now, and I think the Google Doc is super helpful. The point that you've underlined where it says this means there's a symmetry between theism not allowing for the worst worlds and not naturalism not allowing for special creation. Can you just go a little bit more into that? Because I think that's helpful, and then maybe that'll be good for this.
The point I'm trying to make here is that while it is true that theism cannot allow, or at least theism is compatible with a special creation, right? It's not all clear to me that just because theism allows for that naturalism therefore has the advantage automatically. And the reason why is because on naturalism, you are allowed to have non-best kinds of worlds. So you're allowed to have worlds in which only bad things occur, right? And whereas on theism, you can't have that, right? So on theism, that you cannot have a world that is non-best in kind, right? Whereas it's the same thing on naturalism, where on naturalism, you can't have a specially created world, but it's the same thing in theism, except in this case, it's not that you can't have special creation, but rather you can't have a non-best kind of world, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a symmetry there, right? They're tied, basically, right? And so what the naturalist is going to have to do, they're going to have to argue that special creation somehow is the best kind of world, right? Which I don't think it is for various different reasons I don't want to get into here. But my point is, like, there has to be more work done. So you can't just say, oh, well, evolutionary worlds is automatically evidence for naturalism. I would say, well, no, it's not, because you haven't done any work in showing why would an evolutionary world be a non-best kind of world, right?
Okay, yeah.
So that's just the first general consideration I want to point out there, right? Because I hear this argument a lot, and I don't think it works, right?
Yeah, that's helpful.
So that's just the first thing I want to point out, and so this brings me into my 4, I guess, general problems for any problem of evil. Now, the first one me and Tim talked about earlier, right, which was the myth of shared axiology, right? So in order for the problem of evil to get off the ground, it must assume an axiology, right? And the thing with axiology is that the axiology is going to determine the data of good and evil or bad states of affairs, right? And so the atheist in this case must assume a value theory. It's going to have to, the atheist is going to have to assume an axiology in order to show how theism generates false predictions, right? Because the axiology in theism, right, in order to show why, we live in a non-best kind of world, you're going to have to assume an axiology, take theism and say, okay, well, given the axiology, given theism, then theism sort of generates this false prediction, right? But the problem, is that, as Tim was hinting at earlier, there is no shared axiology between the theists and the atheists, right? There's a plurality of different axiologies in which there's disagreements about what could be good or bad states of affairs, what could be, God's goodness, what could be evil, right? Given that. And so my main worry, I get, at least given this problem, right? Given this problem of axiology, my worry is that what Ben is doing is that he's assuming an axiology, and then he's saying, well, the theist accepts this, and because the theist accepts this, then theism is false, right? But it's not all clear to me that the theist has to accept Ben's axiology, right? And the reason why is because the theist is the one that is presenting the theory, right? The theist is the one that should be presenting the axiology. The atheist should not be doing that, right? It's not Ben's job to tell the theist what to believe about axiology. It should be the theist's job to tell themselves what they believe about axiology, right? And so this is interesting because when Ben is talking about unjustified evils, that the reason why there's unjustified evils is because of the value theory. It's because of the axiology that Ben is using. It's not because of the theist axiology, right? So he's not using a theistic axiology to derive an unjustifiable evil, but rather Ben is using his own axiology to do so, right? And so because of that, you're automatically going to run into problems with any sort of argument from evil, including Ben's one here, right? And I don't know if Tim wants to add anything there before I go to my next point, but go ahead if you want to add anything. If you don't, then that's fine. But yeah, you good, Tim? Okay.
Yeah, he gave
So
you
my
a thumbs
next.
up, so.
Okay, cool. I wasn't sure. I'm like switching back and forth between the dock and the StreamYard. Anyways, so the second point is, I think, more problematic for Ben. It's not just the shared axiology point, but there's also this consideration about God as a unique moral agent. Now, I just want to be clear here that I'm not taking Brian Davies' approach. So if Ben is watching this and he thinks I'm going to say that God has no moral obligations, I don't go that far. But I would say that because God is not a human, right? We could all agree to that. Because God is not a human person, then God would be in his sort of like own unique. He would be in a unique moral position, right? And so I would argue, of course, and there's many other theist philosophers like John Snyder, I think that's his name, I can't remember. And then there's also, I know Adams argues this as well. Trent Dowdery argues this point, but that God is, instead of God being constrained by purely ethical considerations, there's also aesthetic considerations, right? And so because of that, then the two general points is one, that because there's aesthetic values open to God, then there can be a sort of cosmic kenosis narrative, right, which has implications for evolution stuff. But I think more importantly, which is what I hinted at earlier, which was the defeat condition, right? And so on the defeat condition, God is authorized to allow evil as long as the evil is defeated within the total existence of whatever evil happens to a creature, right? So I guess okay, now I'll explain what defeat condition is. So an evil is defeated in the context of defeat condition when it is integrated as a part of a viable composable whole, and that the goodness of someone's life not only outweighs the evil, but that the goodness that they attain from the defeat of the evil could not be viable without that defeated evil, right? And so with the defeat condition, I think this would undermine any sort of argument from evil, because as far as I'm aware, pretty much all the arguments from evil, as far as again, I don't know how much, maybe there's a few arguments from evil that don't assume this condition, but most arguments, I think all of them pretty much assume the necessity condition, right? Which is where God is only authorized to allow evils that are necessary to attain a greater good, right? And the problem is that if a theist rejects that condition and rather holds to a defeat condition, then any argument from inscrutable evils or unnecessary evils don't really work, right? Because God is not going to be constrained by those conditions, right? Now, of course, a naturalist, and I think this is what Ben would do, right? What Ben's going to want to say is that minimizing intense suffering and minimizing horrendous evils is intrinsically good. It's intrinsically valuable for God to do so. And so then God sort of has to do it um, by the goodness of God, right? But the problem is that this is making a mistake of assuming that God is motivated by meta-ethical values and not meta-normative values, right? Um, and so I guess the problem here is that it's not at all clear to me that the theist should not believe that God would be interested in defeating evils as an overriding motivation for allowing certain evils, right? Um, so if God has some like overriding meta-normative motivation to defeat evils rather than necessarily minimize them, then I think on this sort of account, then God would be authorizing and justifying, or yeah, God is authorized to allow certain unnecessary evils, right? As long as the evils can be defeated, right? And I think with this condition, I think with the defeat condition, and also with this fact that God can have like overriding meta-normative, motivations to 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 follow that defeat condition. I think this seriously undercuts pretty much any argument from evil in the literature, right? Including Ben's argument, right? Besides the fact that Ben has already, assumed an axiology, right? He's also going to have to assume this necessity condition, right? Which I don't think the theist I don't think the theist has to really accept that condition, right? And again, the reason why is because the theist is the one that is presenting the axiology. So if the axiology tells you that God is constrained by the defeat condition, then it just logically follows that God is authorized in allowing unnecessary evils as long as those evils can be defeated. Then I don't think Ben's argument really is successful here, right? So I just want to point that out. Now, these are just my two. I don't know how much. I have two other main objections. I don't know. Do we have time to get into them?
Maybe if you just briefly sketch them out. That's
okay,
fine.
yeah, that's fine. So the other two problems I see here would be number one, the problem of fine-tuned virtues, right? So given, again, this is assuming a value theory. So I do admit that, I'm not using Ben's axiology here. I'm using sort of my own or a theistic axiology, right? So if God is authorized or if God is motivated to maximize virtues within the context of defeat, right, then this would sort of create a problem for naturalism, right? Where you have this problem of fine-tuned virtues, because in that case, then if God is motivated to maximize virtues, then there has to be a limited range of good and evil states, right? So there's a sort of like a fine-tuned range of good and evil states, right? And so because of this fine-tuned range of good and evil states, then the intensity and frequency of suffering that we see in the world would actually be evidence for theism. And the reason why is because on naturalism, you don't really expect this, right? On naturalism, there's no range of good and evil states that could occur, right? And pretty much almost any state of affairs, at least when it comes to good and evil, like it's pretty much consistent all across the board. Whereas on theism, you're going to have this very limited range of what God could allow, right? Of what type of evils could exist, right? And so because these virtues can only exist given this narrow range of good and evil states, right? Then this would, I think, favor theism against naturalism, given that naturalism doesn't really tell you that there is going to be a fine-tuned range of good and evil states, right? And then the final point, which I think is most important here, is this problem of value mapping in theodicy, right? And so I guess just a quick summary, which is that for theism, you have God, which is all good. So because of God's goodness, then you could sort of map that on to the world and say, okay, God's goodness entails that there's going to be good states of affairs, right? And so then, basically like any good states of affairs would be evidence for theism, right? But on naturalism, you don't have this, right? You don't have, because of the hypothesis of indifference, right? You don't have a good to good mapping from the nature, from the theoretical concept and the hypothesis to the good states of affairs. You don't make any predictions on naturalism in regards to good or bad states of affairs, right? And so this leads to the problem where, in order for naturalism to actually be more probable than theism, given the problem of evil, then naturalism actually relies on theism making false predictions, right? And so this is the basic idea that even if naturalism may not exactly predict the data of evil, theism predicts the opposite, right? And so neutral beats negative, right? And so that's typically the way that Paul Draper, that's sort of how he argues, where it's like, okay, well, even if naturalism does not exactly predict that there's going to be, this or, this number of states of bad affairs, it's at least, a more safer option, right? Given that in this case, Draper or even Ben is going to say, well, theism, just predicts there's only good states of affairs, right? And so if theism only predicts in only good states of affairs, and yet we see bad states of affairs, then naturalism would sort of have the advantage there because it's sort of because it's neutral in that sort of way. Then it's automatically gonna sort of like have a sort of advantage in terms of theism making false predictions, right? So my point is basically that naturalism relies on theism making false predictions, right? But the problem here, the problem with this, of course, with this sort of assumption, is that the moment that theism, or at least the moment that a theist presents a theodicy to explain the distribution of good and evil, the naturalism actually is at a disadvantage because it has no value mapping, right? There's no mapping from the theoretical content of the hypothesis to a good state of affairs or even a bad state of affairs, right? And so what theism allows you to do is, with theism, and when it presents a theodicy, it actually allows you to sort of explain, a good to good mapping from theism or from God's goodness to a good state of affairs, right? And what a theodicy does, it helps to explain the bad states of affairs as well. Whereas on naturalism, you don't have that. On naturalism, there cannot be any explanation for why there's a certain distribution of good and evil states, right? And so because of the value mapping and because of theodicy, then if theism has a theodicy that can actually is successful, right, then that's going to be a big problem for naturalism, right? So these are my 4, I guess, general objections to. I'll stop sharing, by the way, but those are my 4 general, I guess, objections to any version of the problem of evil, and this applies to Ben's argument as well, which is that number 1, he's using the axiology that a theist doesn't have to accept. Number 2, he's assuming that God is a human moral agent, which a theist doesn't have to accept, right? Number 3 is the problem of fine-tuned virtues, and then number 4 is the value mapping and theodicy, of course. So those are my 4, I guess, objections to the argument. I don't. That's why I don't think his argument works. I think what Ben is doing is he's using his axiology to make this argument, but a theist doesn't have to accept that axiology. So.